Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Makers in American Spaces webinar series. I really appreciate your patience waiting for us as we've experienced some technical difficulties, but we should be good to go now. My name is Magia Kraus. I'm the Information Resource Officer based in Moscow, Russia, and I'm here at the American Center in Moscow in our new makerspace, and I'm very excited to welcome our guests today, Kylie Pepler, Gabriella Richard, and John Schimmel. So I'd like to say a few words about our webinar series and some of the resources we're making available to you today before we get started. First of all, please use the chat box to let us know where you're joining us from, and also to share any experiences that you might have about hackathons if you've organized them in your American spaces in the past. And also we've created a survey for you because we'd like to gather your feedback about the webinar series. We'd like to know what kind of topics you want us to talk about. We'd like to know if the pace is good for you, if you have any questions. You'll find that survey as a widget on the event page, and you can scroll down and answer the questions and submit your responses. We also have a Google Plus community that we've created for those of you who are interested in maker programs and maker spaces. And this is an additional resource for you to continue the conversation after the webinar. We are recording this webinar. It will be available to you to watch at a later time. And as you know, the topic for today is hackathons, hackerspaces, and how they can be applied in your context, in your American corners, your binational centers, information resource centers, and so on. We'll be answering questions such as who typically attends these events and for how long, how might we hack a hackathon to be more inclusive of wider audiences, and what are some easy to get started ideas with, or some free and low-cost materials. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guest today. You may be familiar with Kylie Pepler. She's our co-moderator today. She's an assistant professor of learning sciences at Indiana University, director of their creativity labs, and head of the MacArthur Foundation's Make to Learn initiative. Her research at Indiana University focuses on the intersection of arts, media, new technologies, interest-driven learning, and as a result, she's consulted with various libraries and schools on opening makerspaces, and she's our resident expert. She's also visited Russia and Belarus back in September of last year, so she really understands American spaces and the needs of our audience and your contacts here. This is really a professional development series for you to help you expand your program offerings in your spaces. I'm also very honored to welcome Gabriella Richard. She is a researcher, designer, and educator of learning technologies, media, games, and play. She is a postdoctoral fellow for academic diversity at the University of Pennsylvania in the Graduate School of Education. And she received her PhD from New York University. And she looks at issues of equity, diversity, and play, and investigates learning and engagement in youth-based virtual worlds, games, and interest-driven informal activities, as well as tangible and wearable technologies like e-textiles, some of you may be familiar with that, in education and socioculturally equitable and inclusive learning. And John Schimmel co-founded DIY Ability along with Holly Cohen. John is a technologist and tinkerer who teaches developing assistive technology and web development courses at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program. He's been involved with assistive technology design and implementation for several years, and he wants to encourage more people to think creatively about technology and making it more inclusive to people with disabilities. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. I'm going to pass it along to Kylie, who's going to start off our presentation today.
Well, thank you, Maja. It's such a warm welcome, and it's so wonderful to be speaking with all of you. And I hope that I've met many of you in my travels recently. So I want to ask a question of you, and I'm hoping that you will type up some responses in your chat box. So I want you to think about this term, hacking. What kind of connotations? What does it mean to you? So just tell us a little bit up front, how you've encountered the word and what you're thinking about. It's going to be core to our conversations today. So Mancha's going to keep us informed of sort of what you guys are saying. But I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit about the history of the term and where it's come out and why we want all kids to become hackers. So we want to think about why do we need learners to know how to hack? We think that this is the cornerstone, the new bedrock of what it means to be a citizen and a technological society in the 21st century. So if we see all of this technology around us, do we know how to make it? Do we know how to take something that has been produced for market and make it our own? And so you're going to see that theme come up very frequently today in our conversation. So whether that's a website, whether that's a software tool, or a toy that you buy off the shelf, can we actually start to really hack these things and start to modify them in ways that become more personally meaningful for those of us around us? We can't really trust that people are going to be producing all of these tools with the kinds of interests and the kind of values that we have. And so, if you did have this notion about hacking as sort of breaking into banks and stealing credit card information, that's not what we're talking about today. We're not talking about sort of the negative form of it. We're talking about a maker disposition, one tied to innovation and creativity, about really starting to take apart things and start to understand how they work and make subtle shifts in the way that they operate that can have profound impacts on who who uses the technology and why they use it. One of my students, Rafi Santo, has written extensively about what he calls hacker literacies. So this idea of hacking and being hacker literate is this idea of an empowered practice that intends to reconfigure or revise existing technologies via either the technical, social, or legal means. So it's a way of really getting in there and changing things to make them our own. We start to think about, when we use this lens, we start to see that all technologies are political. They're made by people, and all people have politics. And those politics get baked right into the technology themselves. And so they start to reflect our values. You're going to be talking today about the way toys are designed, and that they're really made for kind of normative cultures, and this idea of youth with wide-ranging abilities. And John Schimmel's going to speak to this idea that we can actually hack our toys and technologies to be more accessible for a wider audience. We can see that Wikipedia, for example, if we start to analyze it, values collaboration. Facebook values sharing very personal information to large groups of people. And so we start to see how the technology and our tools can be really tied to the values that we hold. So a hacker starts to understand that the designs are malleable. So if our technology doesn't align with our values, we can change them and move them around to be more in line with our perspective on the world. So we're going to go through a few examples today. We're going to start with Gabriella. She's going to tell us a little bit about Stitchfest and about how we can use the hackathon to make and broaden participation in STEM fields, how we can start to bring particularly women into the fold and invite them to become designers of technologies. John Schimmel's also here today to talk about, from DIYability, to talk about toy hacking and how to make accessibility into the design of toys. And even the future of the internet is up for grabs. So those of you that have been aligned with sort of the free and open source movement, how free and open is our internet? Political decisions get made, certain sites get firewalled, all of these things that we're constantly fighting for, having free and open available access to new information. And so that this is going to be part of this idea of making these hacks, making these designs publicly available. So this returns for me to kind of thinking about what Seymour Papert had said with technology back in the 1980s, is that oftentimes, our current technologies allow for the computer to be programming the child. Think about flashcards. Think about the kinds of ways that we interact with technology where the child, literally learns the information that the computer is teaching the child. But instead, we need to switch this view and think about how the child could program the computer, how the child could really start to create the toys and technologies of the future. And so I'm going to ask Gabriella and John here to tell us a little bit more about what is this hackathon, this kind of event-based way to engage in hacking, and how would you describe it? How would you define it?
Well, I think hackathons tend to be typified by being these very short events, usually over 24, 48 hours, where groups of individuals get together. They think through a problem. They try to come up with a solution that usually involves hacking code or hacking hardware. So playing with different devices, taking apart things, taking apart code, and then coming up with something new, a new solution, which is usually prize-oriented. Sometimes they occur within student communities. Traditionally, I think it's been more of a community-centered thing, although increasingly corporations are using them as means to recruit future employees, to see who the next big talents are. And that's really how hackathons have been for the past few years, although historically they've taken on many forms.
Wow. And so, Gabriella, do you need to be kind of a hardcore hacker to take part in a hackathon?
It really depends on the hackathon. I think traditionally it was meant to be an organic space where people could learn. Some of the earlier hackathons could be a week or 2 weeks long, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the slides. But these days, I think there's more of the sense that you come in with some literacies depending on which hackathon you're part of. Some are more open, it's a learning experience, and some require you to have already competed in a hackathon before. Those are more of the elite hackathons.
Wow. And so, John, I think we've really piqued some interest here around toy hacking. So what does toy hacking mean, and how is that connected to this hackathon experience?
Sure. Toy hacking is kind of been around for decades, I'd say. We'll talk about it in the ability or accessibility of toys for kids with disabilities, teens with disabilities, adults, whoever. And the idea is that you can modify the toy. So a person who might not be able to hold the toy or operate the toy as it was sold could use it with what they have available. So that could be maybe they move their head and they hit a switch, or they have a foot switch, or a sip and puff straw. And the idea of taking the toy apart and modifying it. But the thing about, I think, some of the toy hacks we've learned is that it brings a group of people together that have similar interests in kind of, making the world more accessible. So this could be family members that have either other relatives that have disabilities. It could be people who work in healthcare, occupational therapists, physical therapists, special ed teachers. And it could just be people, we've had people that just come from the tech world who are just tired of working with software all day and they want to take a toy apart. But I also think it has a lot of, for some people it's like, if you ask them if they've ever taken their toys apart as a child, half of them will say yes, and they'll have really fond memories of that until their parents found out or something. So we kind of promote the ability that you should be able to take the toy apart. And for younger people and older people, they can see how the toy operates. And once you take that plastic shell off, the toy is completely, it's a new world inside. It's a microcosm of little circuits and pieces of metal. So yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. I think the hackathons, I've been on both sides of the hackathon. I've been involved with software-based ones that are kind of the weekend sprints. I find them enjoyable but very draining. And then we have shorter ones that are just a few hours and kind of get the message across and get people just to hang out together and to modify something. So.
Great. So I can already tell we're going to have a really rich discussion, both from your personal insights and sort of what you do, both of you do with learners to kind of create some of these events. Gabriella, I'd love to ask you to tell us a little bit more, and particularly about how we can use this event of a hackathon, and how we can start to problematize who might be typically attracted to these events and attract a wider audience. So can you tell us a bit more?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think we didn't fully understand the problem until a few years ago because hackathons have become so popular, even though they've existed in many forms for a long time. Now they have a term, they have a label, and they're big events. And what we've actually seen is that most hackathons are not very diverse in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, and who's getting involved, and that tends to be reflective of computer science and engineering in general, but there are also other nuances to that. And so what we've seen is that there have been attempts to try to create inclusive hackathons, so hackathons that are just targeted to women or just targeted to people of color, minorities, etc., youth. But what we tried to do was something a little bit different, which we'll get into in the presentation, which is we tried to look at interests. And what we've seen in the computer science field is that that works very well when you start to tap into people's interests, and when those interests don't fit the stereotype, people tend to come in, you get more diversity, and you get people who see that their interests and skills are very applicable to where computing is and where it's going. And then you also start to reshape not only the spaces where people hack, but computer science and itself, and the people who see themselves in computer science. So it's actually very interesting to think through how we can bring in all of these new materials and how we can target how these events are being promoted and advertised, and all of those various kind of invisible barriers that we create to create a more inclusive space.
Wow, that's great. I think that's a really great segue into your presentation here today. So could you tell us a little bit more about this work that you've been doing at Stitch Fest to do exactly what you've just been talking about?
Great. Should I just start the slides, or? Okay. So I'll start the slideshow. Okay, so is everyone seeing them? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about hackathons making and broadening participation. I'm going to also talk towards the end about a class that I've been doing that's trying to mimic a makerspace within a high school. But first of all, talking about the equity issues in computer science, we've seen traditionally that there's been some equity issues around gender, which became more apparent in the 80s. Prior to that, women were they sort of made up around 30 to 40% of those pursuing degrees in computer science, but as of 2013, that number dropped to a low of about 18.4% within the United States. And so a lot of universities have been trying to rectify this issue, including Georgia Tech and Harvey Mudd, and they've engaged in various initiatives to do that. But we've also had some equity issues that have been lesser addressed around race and ethnicity. What we find, and then also geography, because in different parts of the country we find that some people are taking AP computer science exams, and what that is in the United States is that in high school students have the chance to learn computer science early on, but what we're seeing is that that's not evenly spread, and it often takes initiatives by individual teachers to try to get more women involved in these courses, as well as diverse students. So as of last year, we saw that only 20% of the test takers were young women, 3% were African American, and 8% were Hispanic. So there have been various initiatives to level this gap. We have some in the United States, which include Girls Who Code, Black Girls Code, and Hour of Code, which tries to bring in different kinds of visual-based coding environments and other environments to students to get them engaged in coding, including Scratch. I don't know if any of you have heard of Scratch, but Scratch is a visual-based coding environment, which is great to introduce newcomers to coding. So there have been these initiatives, these after-school programs to get more people into coding and making and seeing themselves in computer science. However, there's been a lot less attention paid to coding competitions and hackathons. And we talked a little bit about what these are, but they're basically these short-term events, often competitive events, where students can show off their skills, but also get engaged in learning new skill sets because they get together, they learn from each other. They're usually working together in teams to create either, in this case I'm showing the robotics hackathon, the STEM video game challenge. Those are the two on the top. And then there's also Top Coder and Code Wars, which are more of these popular hackathons in this country. And so what these are is they're events to highlight coding accomplishments. This is a time when lots of people are engaged in personally meaningful informal learning with each other, making something that's important to them, making a new product, hacking a product to make something new. It's also a place where a lot of top companies are recruiting, including Google, Facebook, etc. These are great networking opportunities. Sometimes students get a chance to join internships or be part of those kinds of efforts. But there have been equity issues, even though it's very hard to come by these numbers. But the numbers that we do have are around PennApps. Now, PennApps is a student-based hackathon at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's largely considered the premier collegiate hackathon. You have to have already been involved in a hackathon to be part of this hackathon. Students from all over the world come to compete. Top companies give prizes. This is just a slide from last year, but the prizes are actually much bigger now, and there's way more. There are many more participants than there have been in the past. However, traditionally, and we actually went through all of the data, so even though the event was started in 2009, we only have seen less than 15% participation from women. And it's actually a little bit ironic because PennApps was partially started by the Women in Computing and Engineering group at Penn, and at that time, the first PennApps was a week long, and then as the time became shorter, into this 48 hours.
Gabriella? Pause just for a second. We want to increase your slides. So can you click on the home button, and so it'll give you a little bit more space at the top. So just the home up in your upper left-hand corner.
Oh, okay.
It'll decrease that margin.
Oh, I'm not seeing that.
So it's home, themes, tables, charts. If you just click on home, it'll get rid of.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm.
And then if you move your left-hand scroller, you're not going to be able to go into screen share mode. It's just a glitch with Google. But but if you could click, that one. And now if you could take that little bar that is on your left-hand side where those three dots are, and just scroll to the left a little bit to minimize that slide. It'll make it a little bit larger. Sorry, audience. We'll do the best we can. There are some limitations we have just with the tools. But thank you, Gabriella. Go ahead and continue. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Okay, great. No worries. So even though the original PennApps was a week long, and also we discovered that timing is an issue for women being involved, the whole 48 hours not being able to sleep or shower was a big issue and something that they're trying to change in the future. We actually saw the dip from 30% participation in that first year to only 15%. So we wanted to rectify this. And in order to do that, we created Stitch Fest. And if you can see on the left is kind of what PennApps looks like. it's a little crazy. There's a lot going on. And Stitch Fest was a smaller sub-hackathon within this major hackathon. And there were a few things that distinguished Stitch Fest, including that we incorporated the LilyPad Arduino. And I'm not sure if you can see the photos of the Arduino here, the LilyPad Arduino, but the LilyPad Arduino is basically an hardware interfacing kit that uses electronic textiles. So individuals can use conductive thread, conductive fabric in order to create interactive wearables, which is another way to bring in hardware, but to also bring in people's crafting sensibilities and interests. So in addition to having this smaller space within the bigger hackathon, we also incorporated certain elements, including giving everyone hack boxes. And in the bottom left, you actually see what was in the box, which are alligator clips, the LilyPad Arduino, different modules that interface with it, some sensors, a basic startup kit. So we gave everyone these kits, but we also gave them different parts so that they would be encouraged to exchange. And if you see on the bottom right, it's different teams exchanging different parts. And we did that purposefully because we wanted them to engage with each other. We wanted to create a sense of camaraderie or a sense of being able to know who the other teams were, which was not something that usually happened at the main hackathon. And even though these recommendations came out after we did our hackathon, these are all very important because we actually found these in our results, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but NCWIT, which is the National Center for Women in Information Technology here in the United States, came out with a list of top 10 ways to increase girls' participation in computing competitions, which included addressing the promotional materials so that you saw more diversity, actively recruiting diverse participation, which is something that we did. We tried to recruit through the women's groups within the University of Pennsylvania, providing ongoing encouragement at the event, which we tried to do, allow participants to create projects that appeal to them. We did have a theme of wearing care, but within that, they could create whatever they wanted. We encouraged mixed teams of experienced and inexperienced people. Hosting a tutorial or how-to event, we did that ahead of time. So in that way, it helps to level the playing field because many people can learn about the tools before they actually get there and hack, which doesn't always happen at a hackathon. Focusing on learning in different ways to win, we had different kinds of prizes so that people didn't only have to think about certain criteria, but we also included things like most creative, so that even if their project didn't work at the end, it was still this sense of you came up with this amazing idea that was out of the box. So that's also something that can be rewarded. Including female mentors, educators, and judges. We had all women judges. We had women that were involved in the Penn Women in Computing group that were mentors and educators at the event. And making sure the space is accessible. We made sure it was a very accessible space within Penn so it was also very comfortable, and educating others. And so all of these are a good list of recommendations going forward. But the ways that we found helped encourage equity and diversity specifically through our findings, and you can look at the paper, which is there in the file if you want to get more information about this. But we used certain materials which opened up the interests of those who wanted to take part in the hackathon. So we got a lot of non-traditional hackers in our hackathon, including people that were more interested in crafting or more interested in design. We also had this theme of wearing care, trying to encourage people to create products that were personally meaningful and would address issues of not just creating something cool, but something that could be usable and accessible. We encourage sharing across teams, which I talked about before. It was a smaller space within the competition, which a lot of the novices commented on was very helpful to them because otherwise they wouldn't have been part of such a big hackathon. And we used the tutorials and we targeted recruitment so that we had more diversity and we had female mentors and support. So with that being said, within Stitch Fest, we had doubled the number of women who participated within our sub-hackathon, not necessarily within PennApps, although PennApps did have a bit of an increase in female participation that year. And we also saw some very interesting prizes in the sense, I mean, not prizes, but winners, in the sense that while the winner of PennApps was a homework machine, it was actually a machine that could answer all your math homework. Instead, what we saw in Stitch Fest were these variety of projects that were really interesting. If you look at the left, you see that there's a Twitter pin. I'm not sure if you can see here, but there's a woman who created a Twitter pin for social activism. So it was a way to, when there's a cause, being able to broadcast those issues on you personally while also engaging in that within the digital space. The digital cause can also become physical, something that you wear and represent. We also saw teams that created things like an interactive messenger bag that not only had an application but had a wearable component, so anyone could become a messenger. And it was very interesting. It was a way to kind of equalize messengering service, so anyone can make a few bucks, kind of like Uber or Lyft. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. And then we also had other interesting hacks like music players. We had a wearable baby monitor, which I'm not sure if you can see, but it's the teddy bear. It's wearing a wearable baby monitor that monitors whether a baby is getting too hot or too cold. And we also had some hacks of Flappy Birds, which was a popular game at the time, but it made it physical, it made it more interactive within the world. So some things that we found was that we brought in participation. We had more novices involved in this event than in PennApps in general. We had more women, and we had a diversity of backgrounds and interests. But we also brought in perceptions because the folks that participated in our hackathon talked about how they thought about coding and computation and the kinds of skills that complemented that or were necessary for that. They thought about those differently, not only about themselves, the kinds of skills they could learn with electronic textiles and crafting, but also those who had those skills felt more valuable, and also now everyone felt like those skills could contribute in new ways. And yeah.
Oh, Gabrielle, yeah, we've got a question from the audience, and I was just wondering, does it necessitate, do you have to know how to code to do a hackathon? Or might there be other ways to hack hackathons for people that don't even know how to code?
Yes, so it's very interesting. There's been all kinds of hackathons, including a hackathon called Hack the Bells. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it was basically hacking into a bell tower and changing the way that the bells were rung. So you don't necessarily have to have a coding background depending on the hackathon. Some hackathons are set up so that you learn in the process. You may learn how to code while you're there, or it may be more of an idea hackathon. So you may come up just with a cool idea that could be executed elsewhere. So I would say it really depends on the hackathon and what tools and what kinds of end products they're looking for. But in
like that box you were just talking about earlier, it might not even have like a little computer in there. It could have like Scotch tape or other kinds of low-tech tools that people could be trying to hack. Is that correct?
Definitely. I've seen that as well. I think there's more of a proliferation of these alternative hackathons these days, where it's not just about going in and having certain kinds of coding skills, but also design-based hackathons, product-based hackathons. So it runs the gamut these days. It's not necessarily just about coding in the traditional sense.
Right, right. Well, Gabriella, thank you so much for sharing more about Stitchfest, and particularly about what you were doing with the LilyPad Arduino. I know we talked a little bit about it in our first webinar, but could you tell us a little bit, it would be great to bring you back to video so we can see you, but it would be really great for you to tell us a little bit more about, we heard from the folks at SparkFund, we heard about the Arduino microcontroller environment, and now you're talking about the LilyPad Arduino and about how it can integrate with Craft. How easy is that? Is that challenging for newcomers to get involved in? Is it just as easy as an Arduino? Is this good for kind of first-time novices?
I would say from my experience, it's about the same as working with the Arduino. The only added difficulty is that you're working with conductive fabric and thread, which adds another layer of learning, because there's a lot about not crossing the wires. Working with conductive thread is almost like working with a live wire. So there's a whole set of sewing skills that have to be learned along with coding the LilyPad. But it's not necessarily steeper, it's just a second layer that you need to learn on top of learning how to code and make the sensors work, etc.
I've seen people use
another layer.
People use different types of stitches to determine like what's power and what's ground. So we had like one person would use a chain stitch with conductive thread, and some other stitch for the ground. And I just wanted to say is like, without the coding part of it, the conductive elements and just the basic electronics and some batteries makes some really interesting projects. And it's sometimes a little bit more accessible for people that are new to that area, where they can understand the needle and thread part, and throwing a battery in an LED and a switch or a buzzer, it's kind of a nice stepping stone where it's not like, oh yeah, you have to program this and you have to do this to make this thing work. But just getting those basic components into the toolbox is, I think, a really big first step. And I'm sure a lot of people were just excited to learn about the materials, like conductive material and conductive thread. And people are always like, what do you mean it's conductive? Like, what do you mean electricity can flow through fabric? And but then you can say, yeah, you can use this bobbin in your sewing machine, and it kind of just, it all makes sense to them then. So.
Right. Madhya, yeah, you have first-hand experience from all the textiling that we did in the fall.
I do. I learned so much from you, Kylie. We were here in Russia. I have a question from our online audience. They're curious about any best practices or lessons learned that you setting up a hackathon for those who've never done it. We're brand new to this.
Well, I think, first of all, it really depends on who the organizers are. We had to work really closely with student groups, which brought out its own challenges because PennApps is a student-based competition, so often they would tell us things at the last minute, which made it a little challenging. But I think, first of all, promotion is key. I think it's you'll often get a lot of people who will sign up, and the attrition rate is very high. So maybe about 20% of those people who sign up will actually show up. So making sure that you keep everything accessible, you keep promoting. It worked very well when we posted a Facebook group in addition to sending out the promotional materials, so that individuals could keep asking us questions, keep us updated on their progress. Also making sure you understand what the constraints of using those materials are. It's not like individuals can just go to Radio Shack anymore and pick up components. A lot of these things need to be ordered online. So if you are going to have a wearables kind of hackathon, you need to be able to either supply equipment or be very transparent about what kinds of equipment needs they're going to have. And then also just have meaningful prizes. Things that transcend just, this was the best possible product, but think about what's going to engage lots of people, including novices, including people who may not be able to make a working prototype but have great ideas.
Great. You know, when we had a hackathon here at our local library too, we did not call it a hackathon because of the negative connotations, right? So you could call it a codathon or a scratchathon or you know, whatever might have a more positive approach. Particularly if you want parents to kind of bring their young children, it might be a little too subversive to call it a hackathon. But it is worthwhile to kind of reclaim the term. John, maybe you want to speak from your experiences and how to get started. You know, kind of from a toy hacking perspective and basic circuits. We'd love to kind of see some of your slides as well.
Sure. I'll switch over to that. All right. Are we seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Size is okay?
Yes, it appears to be.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm John Schimmel from DIY Ability, and we've been doing, so DIY Ability is a bunch of things. We kind of help, we call ourselves where MacGyver meets assistive technology, and MacGyver being the ultimate hacker, tinkerer in 80s television shows. And we kind of cross between people who have disabilities. We have occupational therapists involved. We have teachers, parents, and just anyone that kind of wants to be kind of into the maker area with something like a meaningful, as they say, a meaningful project that will get used by someone. We've been doing, I think we've had probably over a dozen toy hacking workshops. And when we talk about the word hacking, it's funny, we had one at a pediatric hospital, and the lawyers wouldn't let us call it toy hacking for some reason. They thought that we were going to do something nefarious with the toys in the hospital. So we called it like switch adapting toys or something boring like that. I don't know, just to make them happy. But people really get on board with the toy hacking idea once they understand what it is. And we usually we have one in the winter, in December, called Hacking for the Holidays. And that's usually we do 2 or 3 events in December on the weekends. And we have it at a workshop that can really only hold a few amount of people. So with that, we kind of limit our, we don't have like a giant auditorium or a gymnasium. We really have like a workshop that might hold 15 people comfortably. And that's actually great, because I can only get so many mentors in to help out and help out with people that are new to this. So the photo you're seeing is a stuffed toy monkey, and this monkey does a little dance when you squeeze its left hand, or claw, whatever you want to call monkey. And but if you can't squeeze that hand, how do you make the monkey dance? And so we think about accessibility was like, how do you make objects in the world accessible? How do you make the world accessible for people with limited abilities? This is a remote control toy train, and you can see on the left that there's a blue remote control, and this train has 2 options. It can go forward or it can go back and turn. What we've done, though, is we've attached a pillow switch to it. The pillow switch is just a little piece of foam that can be squeezed, and it will make contact. Now, on the other end of this switch is just an 1/8 inch or 3.5 millimeter mono jack, similar to like the old headphones we would use, or the similar jack that we would put into our telephones or iPods. What happens is these jacks are kind of a standard across accessible equipment and toys, and so this pillow switch will work on other devices that use switch accessibility. And the person might need a switch. This person might use their hand to hit the switch, or they might just use, say, if they have they don't have a hand, they might just use their wrist or their shoulder or their head. And this is just one type of switch, but we'll go through the process here of this basic stuff. So a switch accessibility is that a switch can activate a toy. There's a soft dinosaur, and then there's a giant Nerf gun on the right side. And you can see between the yellow toy gun and the child in the wheelchair, there is a big red button, and that big red button is the switch that this kid uses. And that will activate the toy. Sometimes switches are, you might have one mounted to a wheelchair if you're using a wheelchair, or to your bed. And you can see this bracket here and a switch at the top. That could be positioned anywhere, actually. There's some smaller switches here. We have the pillow switch and then just a contact switch. The ones on the right are just light contact switches, very light touches. And all of these do is just make connections between two pieces of metal. And we kind of start everyone at that level of, like, what is the switch? And we talk about light switches. All right, this slide is just an example of the price of accessible toys. So these toys are just things you could buy at a toy store or on Amazon. But when they become adapted, the catalogs that sell them will, the price increases dramatically. The second one here, this penguin race, I know costs about $15, but once it's adapted, it costs $50. And I'll show you, it really only takes about $3 worth of parts to make it accessible, and in a few minutes once you get the hang of it. So what does it mean we're going to switch adapt it? To make it accessible means we're going to find the switch that is in the toy, and we're going to add a second switch to it. And at the end of that second switch, we're going to add a mono jack. And this mono jack is really what makes it accessible for other people's switches to plug into it and control it. Now this is just a simple circuit diagram I usually show to say, like, if you have a light bulb and a battery, you can have a switch control that the flow of electrons. If you tap this plunger here on the switch, the electrons will flow through. And so we want to find the left and the right side of that switch, and then we're going to modify it. And that's how we find toys when we open them up. So we'll go through this toy real quick. In the remote control, we'll open that up, and it's a whole different world inside of the toy. It looks as if it was, you wouldn't know what it was if you just saw it laying on the street. But essentially, these big blue buttons press down on top of these small little switches on the upper right photograph here. Those contact switches then perform some operation for the toy. Now what we want to do is find these switches, and we want to kind of figure out which solder pads and which contact points we can access to kind of modify it. To put the switch jack together is really just the jack itself costs about, somewhere from 30 to 70 cents, depending on the supplier. And it comes in a bunch of different styles and looks, and you just need 2 wires. And you hook the wires into the loops, and you solder them on. You take the other leads of that switch, and you solder them onto the switch jacks that you found on your toy. Now we have 2 switches modified to the 2 buttons that exist on this toy. Now what happens here is that we don't actually modify the toy, we're just kind of adding a second switch to it. So either switch can still operate it, the existing ones that came with the toy or the new ones that we just added. After that, we take the toy, and this is kind of tricky sometimes depending on the toy. You drill an access hole so you can put the switch jack through it. And most of these switch jacks have little nuts on the end so they can be tightened down to the toy. The basic parts is when we have our workshop, we kind of have, we know how many people are coming, we have kits prepared, and we have alligator clips, we have mono jacks, we have the plugs, the mono plugs, which I'll talk about how we have a cable that's a male-to-male mono cable. We just show people also how to make switches, because it really only takes a few minutes to make a switch. And it's actually one of the more enjoyable parts, I think, of the hacking. So then we start. This is the calm before the storm. We have everything laid out on our tables, and it's kind of clean and seemingly organized, and that things will go as planned, but nothing goes as planned. It usually turns into a tabletop full of screwdrivers, random screws, really hot soldering irons, and it gets more cramped than we ever expected it to be. And this is every event we hold. It's just, oh, we'll have more room, but we never have enough room. But it works out great because people are very when you're close to people, you actually have to start talking to them, and then the communication that kind of falls out of it is an enjoyable part of it. So we've had events that are not as crowded. So evening events tend to be kind of trickier. But on the right, we have a weekend event, usually Saturdays and Sundays. Sundays kind of work better for a lot of people, surprisingly, and we kind of do it in the morning, and people are fresh, and they come, and we get started. It's new to a lot of people, though. And a lot of the people are coming who are professionals in either healthcare or they've maybe soldered once before in their life. But you kind of have enough people maybe walking around and kind of just guiding them. If you see someone struggling, you go over and you just kind of demo it really quick, and then you make sure that they can do it. You make them show that they can do it. It's been great for this. My friend Angela on the right, she brought her date to one event, so it's a great little bonding experience for that. We've had couples, married couples. This couple is working on modifying one of my favorite toys is the remote control whoopee cushion.
Wow!
And so
these are fabulous. I wanted to kind of do like a short brainstorm on just other ways that we might also hack and different kinds of approaches. And so I know that we had an audience member that just mentioned a popular New Yorker article. Had you read that, John, on the breast pump being hacked?
I didn't, but I would love to know more about that.
Yeah, so I think we can make that accessible, but it wasn't really popularized kind of look, and so part of it, there's kind of been two initiatives that I've read. The first one was kind of, people kind of coming together to solve these kinds of problems. I think the social problem here is that they're using hacks to kind of solve and make accessible toys more accessible and at lower cost. You'd hate to think that children have to pay more money that have higher needs, and parents especially that have so many other expenses to then think about paying more for toys. I think that is just really striking when you brought up those. That contrast for us. But there's other ways to hack as well. So we might think about digital forms in Scratch, for example, and Gabriella had mentioned this earlier. We might think about using Mozilla WebMaker. We're going to make these links available to you so you can kind of hack the internet. So you can take any publicly posted page and begin to play with it and what it looks like and kind of borrow code. And you can kind of just see how the internet is made through these types of tools. Mm-hmm. The breast pump hacking was an interesting example because it was about creating breast pumps, new kinds of breast pumps through a hackathon like this. But also people have been sort of using tools that might get thrown away. Kind of, some of these might not even be new toys, John. I don't know if you ever hack, broken toys to either fix them or to mod them in some way. But looking at things that breast pumps in particular, people like to dispose of because they're not seen as being a health risk if you transfer them. So what else could it be made from these types of things that are being discarded in our everyday society? So John, do you have any ways that you've kind of hacked the toy hack? Do you ever fix broken toys or do other things with those?
Yeah, I mean, we tell people to get the cheapest toy possible for the workshop, well, unless they have a child in mind that they might want to be building it for. But people will go to a pharmacy or a toy store and get something that's about $10. The cheaper the toy, the better. People have switch-modified kitchen mixers, which is a little trickier because it's AC electricity instead of DC. That's the one thing we always kind of start off with is you want to use battery-operated toys. Probably should have mentioned that first. But battery-operated toys are the easiest, but they have so many interesting mechanisms inside of them. We've done smoke detectors, but it's also a way to explore the device themselves. And we have these things in our home every day, and we never look inside. And so even regardless of the accessibility point of it, it's just people being able to explore the objects in their world. And I think everyone walks out of there with a new understanding of either if it's just a simple switch or that the fact that they own a screwdriver that can open up one of their like objects in their house that they can just look at it. They don't have to touch it, and I think that's exciting for them. And we don't do a lot of screen-based stuff in these events for programming, but these devices, once they're switch adapted, can be controlled through a microcontroller. And so you can imagine making your own little band with a bunch of musical toys that are then triggered by relays.
Right. Yeah, I think, it reminds me too that, a lot of makerspaces are kind of taking these donations of like broken parts and then harvesting them. And so a good introductory activity might just be, not adding a switch, but it might just be opening things for the first time and finding the switches, finding the LEDs, creating reusable parts, so you can create like a little bin or container of things that you've harvested.
This is, I want to show one more slide. I don't know if my slides are still up there, but this slide is one of my favorites, and this is at a New Jersey STEAM camp, education camp for a STEAM initiative in New Jersey, and these two teachers, they worked together for years, and they had these teddy bears that were hugging, and when you pressed one, they would dance and hug and sing. But you can make your own switch to control the toy that you've modified, and they've made. I just tell people to kind of wrap foil around their hand and then use an alligator clip to connect down to the switch part. And when they high five, it creates the switch. And this is a reaction when it first started to work, because it took forever to get this one wired up. But when it worked, these women were ecstatic, and they still have this apparently in their classroom that the kids want to play with when they have it. So just showing them like simple foil, and one of my favorite switches to make is take a piece of cardboard and bend it in a kind of a 90-degree angle and put foil, 2 pieces of foil on the ends. And now you can bend it so it becomes a foot pedal. And when you step on the angle of the cardboard and the foil touches, you've just made a drivable car without for a remote control car.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so I want to just kind of pull together some of our closing thoughts today. And Gabriella, I don't know if you have anything that you would like to add for our audience, thinking about how could we support maybe English language learners, or how could we support library settings that hacking and how might we do that? How could we pull things in?
Well, that's really interesting, because I think libraries and centers, they're ideal places to have hackathons, but they tend to focus more on maker spaces, and I think that's because of this organic need to want to be more inclusive. But in terms of how they could host hackathons, I think it would be really interesting to reach out to the community. One thing that I thought was interesting about John's presentation is, what did people involved in hacking these toys, what did they take away from this in terms of, did they start their own hacking spaces, or did they take their skills to a new level on their own, and what did that look like? So I kind of think the best ways that libraries and maker spaces can create and foster the sense of hacking in a more inclusive way would be to try to tap into the community and their needs and have them create the hacks or the hackathons of their design.
Right. It reminded me as you were both presenting about how rich this language is. You get, all sorts of new terminology, very, very specific kinds of vocabulary that you're going to be engaging, as well as very basic terminology. So especially toys, for example, have a lot of rich content, from review of colors to different kinds of actions. And so just thinking about it, similar to the ways we create rich environments for children to learn language. If we think about adults of all ages, kind of going back to that, really cementing those basic languages, but then also getting some very sophisticated things. How do you say screwdriver in another language? How do you say, soldering in a different language? And picking up some very usable kinds of skill sets along the way. John or Maggio, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I think the library situation it's interesting, and I've been contacted by a bunch of libraries to kind of help get them set up with simple things. And I think one thing that I haven't seen happen yet is, how could the library help create the resource that they host the workshop and they host the hackathon? But what happens after that? Do they have like a living book or kind of reference for people that might have missed it or are coming back? And could the hackathons at libraries be ways of creating content for communities, and specialized communities come in and kind of leave their mark and then expand on it? Maybe just a wiki, maybe something simple.
Right, right. Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. Kind of just maybe contributing to a wiki, thinking about some sort of way that you're contributing to the code out there. Even you can hack the physical environment. Even for people with a wide range of abilities. For younger learners, for example, small moves like removing the chairs from the space mean that the librarians are up and actually moving around the space. So if you think about this all as, how can you take the mentality of the hacker and think about changing the physical space, thinking about the activities that you can support. It does not need to include code, although code can be definitely one of the kind of the banners of the hackathon and the hacker movement. Younger learners.
Well, jumping in here just a second. One thing we've heard from our online audience is some of them have experience doing the Hour of Code with audiences, introducing coding and programming and these basic skills at a very introductory level. Part of it is introducing the vocabulary as well in English, in a different language, as a starting point, as a jumping off point. And do you have any recommendations for how you would start with something as basic as that and then build upon it and try to identify partners in the community that may have some expertise and can come in and work with libraries to continue that conversation and continue these activities? Introducing coding.
Well, I think students are a great underused resource. I know that at the University of Pennsylvania, students really do want to get involved in these kinds of activities and initiatives, often on their own free time. And they do tend to come in with some of these skill sets already. But I think thinking through some of these long-term sustainability issues would be not only just coming in and teaching others, but trying to build up within the community, forming new sets of expertise. So having students come in and work more as a scaffold to then build up a new base of members in the community that can then teach, and it become more of a community-based thing as opposed to any particular person coming in with expertise and then imposing that expertise is important. And then that would also address some of the English language learning as well, because as you bring in more diversity, you're also going to bring in people who have different cultural backgrounds, who can then teach in a different language and be able to bring that into their cultural understanding as well as their understanding of the code and the technology.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think using students is a fantastic idea. And then sometimes using students to maybe even train teenagers and young adults who might have a volunteer position at the library. So the students can't be there full-time or even part-time, but maybe these volunteers have a longer duration. So having them kind of shadow maybe the semi-professional that has the ability to host a hackathon would be a great start. The other thing is that there's so much beyond the screen, beyond just programming, and I like, just still thinking about the conductive thread and just simple LEDs. I've seen paper circuits used with foil tape, and just showing people the materials is sometimes just enough to get them started. And maybe the hackathon idea sometimes might be too much. Maybe some people aren't competitive and don't want to do this, but they still want to learn a skill. And so maybe the hackathon might take a different context for different communities that you want to bring into the library. Older communities most likely don't want to be competitive in their free time. So maybe there's Hack Your Garden kind of thing. And how can you make a moisture sensor that will either pulse a tone or a little bit more complicated, send you a text message? So how would you find those communities? And I think it's really about framing the message and the projects that you're gonna kind of maybe there's an hour up front of training, and then there's 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of just playtime where they get to explore and make projects, and then there's a show and tell at the end. And then maybe they're on display at the library along with a selection of material that the library curated to say, this is how we did it, this is why we did it. But yeah, and there's so many things. We have so many in our mind that we want to work with right now. And it's hard to pick just one to kind of like pose as a project. But once you pick one, we can just hunker down and plan it out. So yeah, that's really all I have. Just playtime.
Great. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and wrap up, but that's a great way to end. I really appreciate your time, Gabriela and John. You've shared with us such a range of possible activities, from the full-on 48-hour weekend-long hackathon with experts and trying to develop new items that solve social problems, or trying to be more inclusive to women and girls using e-textiles and fabrics and wearables, to using technology and thinking about it in different ways that can open up possibilities for people with disabilities. These are all great. I especially appreciate the comments at the end about how sometimes just introducing circuitry or conductivity and these concepts and giving people the materials and framing the activities in different ways, like Hack Your Garden, depending on the interest and goals of your audience. So I want to really thank you again. Kylie has had another commitment, so we're not able to thank her right now, but we really appreciate her time, and we really appreciate your time as well, Gabriela and John. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
I'm really glad that our audience was able to join us today. I want to say just a couple of things about our upcoming webinars. On March 25th, we've got a webinar with Lisa Regala of Maker Ed, who's going to talk about recruiting local talent with us. And then in mid-April, we've got a webinar on creating library stories with Brian Pitchman and Tara Nostier from Little Bits Electronics Kits. So we've got a lot of things in the pipeline. And as far as today's webinar, we've recorded it. We'll make it available on YouTube, and we also have a survey. We'd love to hear your feedback about the content of the webinar, how useful it is for you, ideas for additional topics, and if you're interested in hearing from us, please share your email. Then we can send you our guest slides from today. We can send you the links and additional materials, and don't forget about our Google Plus community, where you can continue the conversation and ask more questions. And I wonder if Gabriela and John would be willing to answer any follow-up questions after today.
Sure.
Excellent.
I wanted to say thank you. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was nice to meet everyone. Thanks for having me.
Great meeting you. Thank you so much.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.